Hello. I haven't come up with an intro yet. No, I still haven't come with an outro. Now I realize I haven't come out with an intro. So now I neither have an intro nor an outro. I need to work on that. Anyways, moving on to episode 2 of the Adventures in 3D Modeling series. I've actually come up with the idea to try and create a fictitious model because most of the models that I've made so far are real life designs that actually existed. But for the last little while I've been interested in trying to create my own original designs. And sort of a few months ago I came up with an idea for a diesel locomotive, and well, my primary inspirations were one, the Fairbanks Morse Sea Liner that you would have seen in episode 1. And from that one, I was sort of inspired by some of the cab design and just sort of some minor details. In terms of the second one, the second model I was inspired by was the Fairbanks Morse H2466. And from that one, I wasn't necessarily so much interested in the design as I was more just sort of interested in using it as sort of an idea, just sort of getting dimensions. Basically, I'm just basing the dimensions and the size of the locomotive off of the H2466. And lastly, Union Pacific's veranda turbines, which, in the case of those ones, I'm taking inspiration from the sort of exposed walkways on the side of the locomotive, because I think I think those are interesting. I think that's an interesting idea. And, well, later on in the project, I would also take inspiration from a fourth locomotive, that being the Fairbanks Morse Erie built, which is basically just a sea liner, but bigger. And you'll see why I took inspiration from that one later on. But anyways, so my aim is to create an A and B unit and to try and combine hood and car body designs. And I mean, I know this has been tried before with locomotives like the BL2, I think it is. But I mean, the BL2 did not do a very good job on that. Like, you take one look at it, it's a bit of a disaster. And I say it as someone who actually likes the BL2. You just have to take one look at that thing to know it did not accomplish what it was supposed to do. But anyways, I'm going to learn from the mistakes of the BL2 and actually create a, actually sensible compromise between the hood and car body design philosophies, and, well, hopefully I'll do a better job. Not hard to do a better job than the BL2, but whatever. Now, getting into the actual 3D modeling part of the project, I'm going to reuse a coupler from a previous project. I'm going to reuse the horn from the Sea Liner, and as well as the truck that I created in episode 1, the 3-axle truck. And after that, everything else is going to be original to this specific project. And, well, there's not really any history to talk about because, again, it's a fictitious model. So, well, with that, I'm going to give myself a total of 20 hours to complete it. So, let's get started. I started by importing the trucks from the previous model from the 3D warehouse. Then I got to work creating just a basic frame. I imported a simple track model that I had created previously so that I would have a reference for the actual track gauge and dimensions. And this is a model that I created earlier just so that I would be able to, easily create trains without having to create rail references by hand each and every time I had to create a new model. So I'm going to start with the B unit first, just because that's going to be the easiest. And I started by just working on the basic body design, figuring out dimensions and that sort of thing. I tried to add some dimensions with the dimension tool, but, well, SketchUp's dimension tool is pretty shit, to be honest. So I gave up on that pretty quickly. But the dimensions of the model are, yes, it's 70 feet long, 10 feet wide, and it's 15 feet tall. After creating the basic frame, I cut out part of the frame to create the side walkways. I also went about hollowing it out, and I added some pieces to the end. I split most of the model in half just to, reduce the work, although the actual midsection I was able to quarter, so that should reduce the work even further. After that, I added basic side doors and windows, as well as adding doors to the hood, and I started working on the fuel tank. However, while I was working on the basic fuel tank, I hit the 2-hour mark. I quickly finished the basic fuel tank and moved on to creating the side railings. I created the side railings as sort of multiple little components, which allowed me to quickly finish the side rails, certainly a lot quicker than I would have if I had done it some other way. After that, I added a bunch of details to the hood doors, namely grills, hinges, and handles to the door. I moved on to the windows and just quickly created some fairly simple windows and put them into the model. I added handles, a keyhole, and hinges to the side doors, and added windows near the front, though I would make some modifications to those later. And after that, I hit the 4-hour mark. Next, I added more detail in the form of supports on the fuel tank, and then I had to start working on the upper body details. And, well, specifically, what I'm working on is upper grills on the top of the locomotive. And when I started this, just based on prior experience with just other models, like the C-Liner and specifically one other model that I'd worked on, I kind of knew this was just going to be an absolute nightmare because, yeah, just for some reason, grills are an absolute pain in the ass in SketchUp, but yeah. Well, anyways, I started by cutting out a new panel on the roof, and after that, I started working on the grills for the top of the locomotive. And yeah, this was still an absolute nightmare, as I had expected going into it. So I started by just creating a sort of basic grill profile to use for actually creating the grills. And I'm not going to lie, I completely screwed it up because I made it far too simple and just far too basic, not enough detail, and the result is that it didn't look very good. But I needed to move on, so after that, I was able to reduce some work over the previous projects just by splitting the grill into quarters, so I could just reduce my frustration and the work involved. And so I worked on that, which again, it's a very inefficient, tedious process that took a lot of time. And briefly, I tried to move on to creating an actual fan in it to add some more detail, but I just couldn't get it to look right. It just looked... every fan I tried to create just looked really bad. So, yeah, eventually I just gave up on that, decided that I could not afford to waste any time trying to fix it, and, sure enough, as I was sort of coming to this conclusion, I hit the 6-hour mark. After I just gave up on the fans, I moved on to focusing on the ends of the locomotive. I started by just fitting a door to the end of the locomotive, but while I was doing that, I actually had an idea for how I could sort of add some more aesthetic detail to the rest of the locomotive. I decided to try and use the offset tool and the push-pull tool to actually add some, I guess, sort of paneling to the locomotive's sides. and I think that greatly improved the appearance. In addition, for kind of the same reasons, I added a panel to the roof, which again helped with the detail. But after that, I got back to working on the end details, basically just adding panels and windows to the ends. However, partway through, I had to completely redo the ends because I realized that I had made a mistake when I was creating them. Basically, I had placed them slightly incorrectly, and that was producing a bunch of sort of measurement errors that, based on my prior experience with other models, I recognized that allowing those sorts of errors to go uncorrected usually created more headaches and more work than it would have been to just redo the thing. So that's what I did. I redid it. That took a bit of time, but I was able to redo it fairly quickly. And after that, I just got on to work creating separately fitted panels for the ends, and those ones were fairly simple. It required a bit of work just to get them to fit in properly, but overall it was fairly manageable. After that, I decided to move on to creating exhaust pipes for the roof. And I had the idea, because basically most of the locomotives that I've seen have generally sort of straight up, basically just straight, very simple exhaust pipes that just stick straight up into the air. And from the little bit I've read, apparently that does cause problems with like water entering the engines, just like rainwater falling down the pipes. So I thought it might be a good idea to instead have it sort of curve off at a 90-degree bend, just to prevent that from happening. I don't know why, locomotives in real life don't do that. I would assume there is probably a reason, and that, there is probably a reason they don't do that, basically, but I don't know. I thought it might at least have some aesthetic benefits, so that's what I went with. And sort of as I was finishing up the exhaust pipes and just finalizing the design, I hit the 8-hour mark. The halfway mark was now rapidly approaching, so I quickly placed the exhaust pipes, and I had the idea to modify the front cab windows so that I would have two different variants of the locomotive, because originally I designed it with the idea of it being independent, in that it would have controls inside of it so that it would be able to move on its own inside a yard or something, just for convenience sake. But I also wondered if the locomotive, if the B unit might not also be made as sort of a dependent unit that couldn't be moved around. And I just thought that might be a good idea simply because, based on my research, I know that some railways thought that it was a good idea to have them sort of semi-permanently coupled to A units, and thus there wasn't really any need for dependent movement. And also, again, based on my research, it was also quite common for basically union complaints to try and cram as many workers on trains as possible, and just sort of in some cases to try and get around that, they would specifically have the B units designed so that there weren't any crew spaces in them, just because you can't put crew in a locomotive if there's nowhere for the crew to go. So I thought that that would be a good thing to add, so I just quickly removed the front cab window and just modified it so that I could have two different variants, and I used tags so that I could just have both features in there, and I could just switch between the two as however I felt like it. And yeah, after that, I moved on to just adding some details to the frame, specifically just some side steps into the frame where the doors would be, as well as hatches just to the bottom of the frame, which was sort of a bit of inspiration I took from the H2466. After that, I moved on to actually adding the side ladders, and I made them sort of curved, partially due to sort of some information I learned about the H2466 and sort of similar Fairbanks Morse locomotives, which is that they had, completely straight side ladders, but the ladders weren't very well liked because the crewmen, as they were trying to climb up, would keep knocking their shins against the ladders, and I thought that the sort of solution to that would be to sort of add a bit of a curve to them, and that would resolve the issue. I also partly did it just because I thought there might be sort of interesting, sort of aesthetically interesting, I guess. Just kind of reminded me of sort of the steps on older coaches. And after that, I just went back to adding a few more details to the fuel tanks. And, well, as I was finishing that off, I hit the 10-hour mark. So I was halfway through the project at this point, and that meant that I thought it was a good idea to now start on the A unit. Now, most of the A unit could just be built by copying or modifying parts from the B unit. Of course, the problem is similar to what happened with the C liner, which is the cab. Now, my original design was to create a cab that was sort of similar to the C liner's cab, but sort of a lot more, I guess, sort of squished in. Like it would have a shorter nose, just generally a little more squished, I guess. But the problem was it was just such a hassle to get the actual cab to look right that by the time the 12-hour mark came up, I had accomplished very little. And so I was, starting to waste time a bit. And that didn't get any better for, the 14-hour mark because I kept trying to come up with a basic design. And I eventually managed to get something that was vaguely like what I wanted, but I decided it wasn't good enough, and so I had to throw that out. And while trying to come up with other ideas, this is where I came up with the idea to try and base a different cab design off of the Fairbanks Morse Erie built. And basically by the end of the 14-hour mark, I was able to, finally get the FM Erie built sort of inspired cab done, or more or less done. But, it took me so long, I was still working on it by the time the 14-hour mark passed. At this point, the cab design was coming together, but just due to the way that I had put it together, I needed to do a lot of cleanup work just to sort of get it up to my standards. And that, required a lot more time to be wasted just putting together this cab. And I eventually managed to finish the basic cab design, but it took far too long. This should not have taken me 5 hours just to get a cab design done. But I managed to get the cab done, so I moved on and got on to adding the cab windows, which was certainly much easier. And I also moved on to getting the frame modified so that it could actually accommodate the new A unit cab. And, I added some minor detailing to the cab and also added some grills just behind the cab on the side of the locomotive, just to add some more detail. And this time, since I was just very displeased with the job I had done on the roof grills, I made a specific point to make sure that this grill was actually done competently, and fortunately, I think I did a pretty good job in that respect. But as I was working on that, I reached the 16-hour mark, which means that I'm kind of running out of time now. I quickly finished the grill and then moved on to adding just various details across the locomotive. I started by adding some bolts just to various parts of the locomotive, and the reason I did that is just because I've found from previous projects that adding bolts really helps with the actual just detail and appearance of the model. I also added some additional detail to the steps just because I wasn't satisfied with how plain they looked. And after that, I moved on to working on the front plow. Now, in order to start, I did have to make a few modifications to the sort of front base of the locomotive and finish that off, but I decided to start working on the plow, and I started just by making a very basic version that I would finish off later, just because I wanted to get other things done first before I moved on to working on the plow. I then moved on to the headlights, but I was able to get those done in a fairly reasonable amount of time, and I was fairly happy with the end result. And I noticed that I was coming, somewhat close to the 18-hour mark, so I decided to start trying to add railings to the side ladders, again, just because that's a detail I knew I would need to add. It was a detail that I suspected, I wouldn't want to leave until the end, just because it might take a bit of time and might have a few complications, and I didn't want to, risk getting stuck, halfway through the design, so I got those done now rather than later. And as I was working that, I reached the 18-hour mark. Time was running out now because I only have 2 hours left, so I hurriedly finished up the side railings and then moved on to importing the couplers. Now, importing the couplers was fairly easy. I just needed to, once I got them in, I just had to put together a sort of coupler box for them and then just install those. And speaking of coupler boxes, I decided at this point that it was a good time to now finish up the front plow, since I knew where I wanted to install the couplers. So I put those in, cut out a hole for the coupler at the front, and then modified the sides of the plow so that the truck wouldn't bump against the plow when the train was hitting any corners or anything. And then after that, I added some diaphragms to the ends of the locomotives, and these were fairly simple diaphragms at first, and I wasn't very happy with them, but I moved on to just adding some, again, very basic details that, to be honest, weren't very good, and I decided to just go back to adding some more bolts to various places, and eventually I looked at the diaphragm again and thought that I knew how to potentially improve it, and that involved just sort of adding some little ridges to it, which I think did somewhat improve it. And then I put together some supports for the diaphragms, and just after I finished that, the 20-hour mark was hit, and the project was completed. And here's the final product. After 20 hours of work, I would say that this thing is more or less complete. So I would say that's challenge successful. Now, overall, when I originally created the project, I wasn't very happy with it, but it has grown with me as I was editing the project. Overall, I think I'm generally happy with the result, although I still think it could do with a lot of improvement. Namely, these grills here, I am very, very unhappy with them, and I would certainly not be. I'm just very unhappy with these grills, and wouldn't mind replacing them with something better. And also, looking at the model in hindsight, I think the space between the B and A unit here is a bit too far apart. Like, I think this is a 3-foot gap here, and I think it should be closer to 2 feet. It just looks really funny. And I'm also not keen on just sort of the lower part of the ends of the locomotives. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I don't know. It just seems a bit off to me. I'm not particularly happy with this, and I'd probably like to change that if I had more time. But overall, like I said previously, I think I'm quite happy with the end result. I might consider doing a sort of a mini challenge just to add a few details onto it and make a few improvements, but that's not my highest priority right now, though if there is interest in it, I would certainly be willing to do it. Now, in terms of my next model, well, I already know what my next model is going to be, but in terms of my next train-related model, I have some ideas. In terms of real-life models that I could recreate, I have been interested in recreating subway trains, and I have some ideas with regards to that, and that's probably near the top of my list in terms of things I want to do in the near future. But, well, other ideas I have is that I have a bunch of unfinished real-life train models that I just have sitting around on my computer, and those could be sort of potentially shorter challenges, just finishing off old models and bringing them up to my current standards. But, potentially a little more interestingly are my ideas for fictional models. So, for example, I have an idea for an 020 steam locomotive, which, if you know anything about white notation, I'm sure you're very confused right now. Don't worry, if I happen to make a video on that design, you'll understand it a little better. Well, actually, you probably won't, because it'll still be utterly bizarre, but whatever. As for other sort of fictitious models, well, I do have some ideas regarding making extremely large steam locomotives, but I won't say anything about that. But yeah, I will say I have ideas. I have some ideas, and well, you'll see if you'll see them when they come into existence. We'll say that. But in terms of the next model, it'll probably be, well, I actually know exactly what the next video will be about because I've already recorded it. But in the near future, I suspect there will be both train-related models and models that are not train-related. I won't say anything about that for now. Like I said, you'll find out when those videos come out. But, yeah. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. Oh, by the way, I haven't come up with a name for the fictitious diesel locomotive that I made today. The name I've been using as a stand-in is the F6D, but it's literally just short for fictional six-axle diesel. So the model could definitely do with a name. And if you have any ideas, I would love to hear them because, like I said, I have no ideas for any sort of proper name to give it. But yeah, I'd say that's it for now. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and yeah, hopefully within a week there'll be another video coming out, and I don't have an outro, so goodbye.